In 1928, a Peruvian archaeologist named Julio Tello was excavating a burial site on a desolate stretch of desert coastline when his team uncovered something that looked, at first glance, like it belonged to a different species entirely. Buried beneath the sand were more than 300 human skulls, and dozens of them weren't shaped like any human skull should be. Some stretched nearly 60% taller than a normal head, tapering upward into a smooth, elongated cone with none of the natural curves or proportions you'd expect from a human skull. For decades afterward, people speculated these were aliens, a hidden species, anything except what they actually were. But the real explanation is stranger and far more human than any of that. These weren't a different species. They were ordinary infants whose skulls were deliberately, carefully, and permanently reshaped by their own families on purpose as an act of love. And once you understand why entire civilizations across completely different continents independently decided to do this to their own children, you'll never look at a human skull the same way again. Let's start with the basic biology that makes any of this possible in the first place, because it's the key to understanding everything else in this video. A newborn human skull isn't one solid, fused piece of bone. It's made of several separate bony plates connected by soft, flexible joints called sutures, with open gaps between them called fontanelles, the same soft spots most parents are warned to be careful with. This isn't a design flaw. It's precisely what allows an infant's skull to squeeze through the birth canal, and more importantly, it's what allows the skull to keep expanding rapidly to accommodate a brain that's still growing at an extraordinary rate throughout early childhood. But that same flexibility that makes healthy brain growth possible also makes something else possible. If you apply steady, sustained pressure to specific parts of a baby's skull during roughly the first year or two of life, before the bones fully harden and fuse together, you can permanently guide the shape that skull ultimately takes. Not through violence, not through trauma, through the same kind of slow, patient pressure a gardener might use to train a young tree to grow in a particular direction. Once you understand that mechanism, the practice itself becomes almost mechanically simple to describe, even though it required extraordinary cultural commitment to actually carry out. Caregivers would bind an infant's head tightly with cloth or cord, or press it between two flat wooden boards secured with bindings, applying gentle, continuous pressure to specific areas of the developing skull. The Maya of Mesoamerica became particularly associated with this technique, developing a specialized apparatus, similar in basic concept to a cradle board, specifically designed to flatten and elongate an infant's forehead over months of continuous use. This wasn't a single afternoon procedure. It was an extended, deliberate act of caregiving, repeated daily for months or sometimes years until the desired shape had fully set into the bone. It's worth pausing on the infant's actual experience here too, because it's easy to discuss this practice purely in terms of culture and symbolism, while skipping over what it would have physically felt like to be the child at the center of it. Modern medical understanding of infant skull development suggests that sustained, gradual pressure of this kind, applied carefully over months rather than through sudden force, would not necessarily have been acutely painful in the way a broken bone or open wound would be, since the technique relied specifically on gentle, cumulative reshaping rather than trauma. That said, infants can't consent to this kind of alteration, and it's worth being honest that we simply don't have direct testimony from the people who experienced it firsthand about what those early months actually felt like. What the archaeological and skeletal record does consistently show is an absence of the kind of damage, infection, or skeletal distress markers you'd expect to find if the practice had been widely experienced as traumatic or abusive within these societies. Whatever we make of it through a modern ethical lens, the people actually doing this to their own children across dozens of unconnected cultures and thousands of years clearly didn't experience it as cruelty. They experienced it as care, applied with exactly the same devotion a parent today might bring to braces, sunscreen, or any other long-term investment in a child's future appearance and standing in the world. Now here's where the story becomes genuinely global, and genuinely strange, because this wasn't some isolated regional custom. Evidence of intentional cranial deformation has been found on nearly every inhabited continent, practiced by cultures that had absolutely no contact with each other, separated by oceans and thousands of years. In the Andes of ancient Peru, the practice reached an extraordinary scale among the Paracas culture, flourishing roughly between 800 BCE and 100 BCE. The exact civilization behind those 300 skulls Julio Tello uncovered. Thousands of miles away in Central Asia, nomadic groups known as the Huns, the same confederation later led into Europe by Attila, favored a distinctly different style, wrapping infant heads with bands of cloth to produce a cylindrical, ring-shaped deformation known as annular deformation. When the Huns expanded westward into Europe in the 4th and 5th centuries, several Germanic tribes under their influence, including the Gepids and Ostrogoths, adopted the exact same custom for their own children. Australian Aboriginal communities practiced their own forms of the tradition. Various indigenous groups across North America did too, including tribes in the Pacific Northwest and the American Southeast, each developing independent methods and independent styles, without any shared origin connecting them. And it goes back even further than any named civilization. According to research published in the medical journal Curious, the earliest confirmed examples of artificial cranial deformation come from 2 Neanderthal specimens, meaning this practice may not have originated with modern humans at all. If that dating holds up, it means the impulse to deliberately reshape a child's skull is old enough to predate our own species, a behavior potentially inherited or independently reinvented by Homo sapiens rather than something we came up with entirely on our own. So with a practice this ancient, this widespread, and this deliberately effortful, the obvious question becomes why? What could possibly be worth binding an infant's skull for months, sometimes years, at a time when infant mortality was already brutally high in most of these societies? The answer isn't singular, and it's worth sitting with each explanation individually, because together they paint a genuinely revealing picture of how these ancient cultures actually thought about identity itself. The most consistently documented motivation across nearly every culture that practiced this is social status. In numerous Eurasian societies, including the Huns and various Central Asian tribal groups, a specific elongated head shape functioned as a visible marker of nobility or membership in a priestly class, instantly signaling rank to anyone who saw it. In a world without photographs, uniforms, or written records most people could actually read. One researcher studying the origins of medieval European nobility has even suggested, though this remains a debated and unconfirmed etymological theory, that the modern phrase heads of state may trace back to exactly this custom, elite families literally shaping their children's heads to visibly mark them as born to rule. Among cultures like the Tiwanaku of the Andes, distinct styles of cranial deformation corresponded to specific social castes or lineages, meaning you could likely identify someone's family background and social standing simply by observing the particular shape of their skull, a permanent, unforgeable badge of identity carried on the body from infancy onward. If any of this is making you look at your own skull a little differently, that's honestly the entire reason I keep making these videos. And if you'd like more of this kind of history that never made it into your textbooks, subscribing means you won't miss what gets dug up next. Because status wasn't the only motivation driving this practice, and the next explanation is arguably even stranger. Ethnic and group identity was just as powerful a driver as status, in some cultures arguably more so. In numerous documented cases, cranial deformation functioned as a permanent, unmistakable marker distinguishing one community from its neighbors, a way of visually declaring exactly which group you belonged to before you'd ever spoken a single word. This mattered enormously in regions where multiple distinct peoples lived in close proximity, sometimes as rivals, sometimes as allies, and being able to instantly identify friend from stranger carried real social and even survival value. Unlike clothing or jewelry, which could be removed, stolen, or copied by outsiders, a skull shape set permanently in infancy couldn't be faked, borrowed, or abandoned. It was identity made literally unforgeable, carved not into stone or metal, but directly into the architecture of a person's own body. There's also a spiritual dimension to this practice that shows up repeatedly across completely unrelated cultures, and it's genuinely fascinating how consistent it is. In the Nahai-speaking communities of Tomman Island in the South Pacific, an elongated head shape was specifically associated with greater intelligence, higher social status, and, notably, closer proximity to the spirit world. This exact same pattern, linking an altered skull shape to divinity, wisdom, or supernatural closeness, echoes across cultures with zero possible contact with each other, which raises a genuinely interesting question about human psychology itself. Why would completely unconnected societies keep landing on the same basic idea, that a taller, more elongated head somehow signals a mind closer to the divine? One recurring theory among researchers is that a taller cranium may simply have looked intuitively like it contained more room for thought, more room for a soul, more room for whatever a given culture believed made a person wise or holy, an almost universal piece of visual logic that different societies kept arriving at independently. This idea of divine or godlike status through skull shape shows up most dramatically and most controversially in a comparison researchers have drawn between two rulers separated by over 1800 years and half a continent. Akhenaten, the so-called heretic pharaoh of ancient Egypt, is consistently depicted in official artwork with an unusually elongated skull. King Gila, a 5th century ruler known as the god king of the Alchon Huns, is depicted the exact same way in his own official imagery. Both men explicitly claimed divine status during their reigns, positioning themselves as gods living among ordinary mortals, and both chose to visually reinforce that claim, using the exact same physical trait, a skull shape distinct from everyone around them. Researchers studying this comparison have concluded the two cases likely have very different underlying explanations, with Kingila's elongation showing stronger evidence of genuine artificial cranial deformation, while Akhenaten's may reflect artistic convention, a possible medical condition, or a deliberate stylized exaggeration rather than an actual altered skull. But the underlying instinct connecting both rulers is identical regardless of the specific cause. An unusual head shape, worn publicly and unapologetically, became a tool two completely unrelated god kings both reached for to visually separate themselves from the ordinary humans they ruled over. Now, a question that inevitably comes up whenever people first learn about this practice, and it's a genuinely fair one. Did permanently reshaping an infant's skull actually damage the brain inside it? This is where the science gets more nuanced than you might expect, and it's worth walking through carefully rather than giving you a simple yes or no. A widely cited 2007 study published in the journal Neurosurgery found no anthropological evidence linking cranial deformation to cognitive impairment, and a separate 2003 study concluded that while the practice dramatically altered the outward shape of the skull and face, there was no meaningful difference in overall cranial volume, meaning the brain itself wasn't necessarily being compressed or shrunk, simply reshaped into a different container. This makes intuitive sense once you understand the underlying biology. The total space available for the brain to grow into wasn't necessarily reduced, just redistributed into a different overall shape, the same total volume of liquid poured into a taller, narrower glass instead of a wider one. Modern examinations of thousands of skeletal remains support this conclusion. Individuals who underwent cranial deformation appear to have lived full, normal lives within their societies, working, worshipping, raising families, and in some cases fighting in wars, exactly like everyone else around them. That said, it's worth being honest that not every researcher agrees this practice was entirely without risk or consequence. A separate review published in 2013 argued the opposite conclusion, suggesting that in at least some cases, cranial deformation may have negatively affected specific regions of the brain, potentially contributing to difficulties with concentration, memory, or motor coordination in certain individuals. This disagreement within the scientific literature itself is worth sitting with, rather than smoothing over for the sake of a cleaner story. The honest answer, based on where the current evidence actually stands, is that cranial deformation likely carried some level of individual variation in outcome, probably influenced by exactly how much pressure was applied, how gradually, and over what period of time, but that the overwhelming majority of the archaeological and skeletal record shows people living complete, functional lives afterward, generation after generation, in societies that clearly didn't consider the practice to be causing them obvious, widespread harm. Before you file this entirely under ancient people did strange things, it's worth pointing out how much closer this impulse sits to modern behavior than most people initially assume. Humans today still routinely reshape their bodies, often permanently, in pursuit of an idealized appearance dictated by their specific culture. Cosmetic surgery, tattooing, piercing, deliberate scarring, even the modern practice of infant ear piercing, performed by loving parents who see it as an act of care rather than harm. In several parts of the world, orthodontic headgear is still used today specifically to guide the growth of a child's developing jaw and skull structure into a more culturally desirable shape, using the exact same underlying biological principle, sustained pressure applied during a developmental window, that ancient cranial deformation relied on. The materials have changed. The specific shapes considered desirable have changed dramatically, but the fundamental human impulse, using patient, sustained pressure during childhood to physically shape a body into whatever a given culture defines as beautiful, worthy, or high status, never actually disappeared. It just moved to different parts of the body and got a different name. It's also worth briefly addressing the more sensational claims that have attached themselves to sites like Paracas over the years, because a good history video shouldn't dodge the fringe theories viewers may have already encountered elsewhere online. Some popular commentators have speculated that the most extreme Paracas skulls might belong to an entirely different, possibly non-human population, with cranial deformation practiced afterward, specifically to imitate this supposedly superior, naturally elongated head shape. Mainstream archaeologists and physical anthropologists who have directly examined these skulls have found no genetic or skeletal evidence supporting that idea. The bone structure, growth patterns, and underlying anatomy are consistently human. What changes is the outline created by binding, not the fundamental architecture of the skull or the species it belonged to. The real explanation doesn't need aliens or a lost hominid species to be remarkable. 300 human families choosing, generation after generation, to reshape their own children's heads by hand is already a genuinely extraordinary piece of human behavior on its own. For all its scale and endurance, this practice didn't fade away naturally through changing tastes or gradual cultural drift, the way most fashions eventually do. It was actively stamped out. When European colonial powers arrived across the Americas, they consistently viewed cranial deformation as a marker of paganism and primitive superstition, and colonial authorities in Peru and Mesoamerica moved deliberately to suppress and eventually outlaw the practice, treating it as something to be erased rather than simply left alone. Within a few generations under sustained colonial pressure, a tradition that had endured continuously for well over 2,000 years in some regions collapsed almost entirely. It's a genuinely sobering pattern once you notice it, a practice that outlasted the rise and fall of the Paracas, the Nazca, the Wari, the Tiwanaku, and the Inca Empire itself, one that survived for millennia through countless political upheavals, wars, and cultural shifts, was largely wiped out within roughly a century of sustained external pressure. A handful of more isolated communities held on to modified versions of the tradition into the 20th century, but as a widespread cultural practice, it was functionally gone. So, what actually connects a Peruvian mother binding her newborn skull 3,000 years ago to a Hunnic family on the Central Asian steppe wrapping cloth around their infant's head, to an Egyptian or Central Asian ruler claiming divinity through the exact same physical trait? None of these people ever met. None of them shared a language, a religion, or a written tradition, and yet, independently, over and over, across a staggering span of human history, they arrived at remarkably similar conclusions: that the human body, even in its most literal, physical, skeletal form, could be deliberately shaped into a permanent statement about who you were, where you belonged, and how close you stood to whatever your culture considered divine. It wasn't mutilation, and it wasn't cruelty, at least not from the perspective of the people practicing it. It was one of the oldest, most intimate acts of identity making available to any human society, taking the single part of your child's body destined to outlast everything else, the skull, and deliberately, patiently, lovingly shaping it into something that would carry meaning for the rest of that child's entire life. If this is the kind of hidden history you come here for, subscribing means the next one finds you automatically, because there's a lot more of the human body's strange, deliberate history still waiting to be dug up.